My in-laws flew to Tuscany the morning I was rushed into emergency surgery, and my husband went with them. What none of them knew was that my grandmother had been watching every move they made, saving every message, every excuse, every silence. And she was waiting for the right moment to make sure the whole family heard the truth. I had been married to my husband for 4 years when the pain started. It came on a Tuesday in February, sharp and insistent, somewhere in my lower abdomen. I told myself it was nothing. I had a presentation at work the next morning, a dinner party my mother-in-law had been planning for weeks, and a calendar so full, I couldn't imagine making room for something as inconvenient as being sick. So I took 2 ibuprofen, went to bed early, and hoped it would be gone by morning. It wasn't gone by morning. It was worse. By Thursday I was at the walk-in clinic. By Friday I was in the ER. The doctor who examined me was calm and direct in the way that makes your stomach drop. She explained that I had a serious ovarian cyst that had grown larger than they were comfortable with, and there was a real risk of torsion, meaning the ovary could twist and lose blood supply entirely. Surgery was not optional. She wanted me scheduled within the week. I sat in that examination room for a long time after she left. I was 31 years old. I was scared in a way I hadn't been since I was a child. I called my husband from the parking lot. He answered on the 3rd ring, and I told him everything the doctor had said. There was a pause. Then he asked if we could talk about it when he got home, because he was in the middle of something at the office. I drove home alone, and sat in our kitchen until the light outside turned gray. The surgery was scheduled for the following Wednesday. My in-laws' trip to Tuscany, a 10-day vacation the 3 of them had been planning since the previous spring, was leaving that Saturday. I am not proud of how small and desperate I felt when I asked my husband if there was any way to reconsider the timing. I didn't ask him to cancel the whole trip. I just asked whether he might delay joining them, maybe fly out a few days later once I was through the worst of it. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as inconvenienced. He said the flights were non-refundable. He said his parents had been looking forward to this for months. He said the surgery was scheduled, the doctors knew what they were doing, and I would be in good hands. He said I would probably be discharged within 2 days, and he would be back before I even noticed he was gone. I didn't say anything after that. I just nodded and went to make dinner. That weekend, my grandmother drove 4 hours from her home in New Brunswick to be with me. She arrived Friday evening, carrying a casserole dish wrapped in a tea towel, and a small bag she clearly intended to leave by my front door for longer than a night. She was 73 years old, moved a little slower than she used to, and had the kind of quiet authority that filled a room without effort. She didn't say anything dramatic when she arrived. She just put the casserole in the oven, sat down at my kitchen table, and asked me to tell her everything. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she simply said, "I'll be here Wednesday." My husband left Saturday morning. My in-laws met him at the airport, and I watched from the kitchen window as the cab pulled away from the curb. My mother-in-law had waved at me from the window. I waved back. My grandmother made tea and didn't mention it. The morning of the surgery, she was up before I was. When I came downstairs at 5:30, she had already made oatmeal, packed a small bag with things she thought I might want after. A soft cardigan, lip balm, a book she knew I liked, and was sitting quietly at the table with her own tea, reading. She looked up when I came in and said, "Eat something small. You'll want something in you before they stop letting you." I managed half a bowl. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. At the hospital, she sat beside me while nurses asked their intake questions and attached monitors and adjusted things I didn't understand. She answered when I couldn't remember dates or medication names. When a nurse asked if there was anyone coming to be with me, my grandmother said simply, "I'm here." As though that was the entire answer, because it was. When they came to wheel me into the operating room, I reached back and found her hand. She squeezed once firmly and said, "I'll be right here when you wake up." I believed her. She was the only person I believed that week. I came out of the anesthetic slowly, the way you do when your body doesn't quite trust the world yet. Everything was too bright and too loud at a low hum. My throat hurt. I tried to turn my head and found it heavier than expected. When my eyes finally focused, my grandmother was sitting in a chair beside the bed, a crossword folded open on her knee and her reading glasses pushed up on her nose. She looked up the moment I moved. "There you are," she said. I started crying before I could help it. Not from pain exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was the relief of seeing someone who had stayed. My husband texted that afternoon. The message said they had arrived safely and the hotel was beautiful. He hoped the surgery had gone well and asked me to let him know how I was feeling. It took him 6 hours to send that message. I had been in surgery and recovery since 7 in the morning. I put my phone face down on the bedside table. My grandmother didn't comment on the messages, at least not out loud. But I noticed that she picked up her own phone each time one arrived, read it carefully, and set it down with a look I had learned to recognize over the years. She wasn't saying anything. She was just watching. The recovery was harder than anyone had prepared me for. I had known, intellectually, that abdominal surgery took time. What I hadn't understood was what that actually meant in my body on a Tuesday morning, when I needed to get from the bed to the bathroom and every single movement required a decision. My grandmother was there for all of it. She helped me sit up when the muscles wouldn't cooperate. She timed my medication so I never missed a dose. She slept in the guest room and left the door open so she could hear me if I called. My in-laws, meanwhile, were posting photos on Facebook. Vineyard tours. A sunset dinner in Siena. My mother-in-law standing in front of the Duomo with a gelato, smiling. My father-in-law at a wine tasting with his arms spread wide, like a man who had never had a worry in his life. My husband's messages were short and intermittent. Thinking of you. Hope you're feeling better. We had the most incredible pasta tonight. Wish you could have been here. That last one arrived on my 3rd day home from the hospital, while I was sitting with a heating pad pressed to my abdomen trying not to breathe too deeply. I read it 3 times. I still don't think he realized what he'd sent. There was one afternoon, about a week into my recovery, when I was sitting by the window watching the snow come down. It was late February in Nova Scotia, and the world outside was gray and ungenerous. And I just started talking. I don't know what made me start. I think I had been holding it in for long enough, that it simply ran out of room. I told my grandmother that I had been thinking about our marriage differently lately. That I kept replaying moments I had explained away at the time. And I wasn't sure I could explain them away anymore. That I was scared, not just of what had happened, but of what it meant. My grandmother listened to all of it. She didn't rush me, and she didn't give me easy answers. When I finally stopped talking, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I've thought about many times since. Pay attention to what people do when it costs them something, she said. That's when you find out who they really are. After that conversation, I noticed her paying closer attention to things, not intrusively. She was never the kind of woman who made a scene. But whenever a message arrived, she read it before I did sometimes, and she always kept her phone nearby. I didn't ask what she was doing. I assumed she was staying in the loop, maybe talking to my mother. What I didn't know was that she had already started keeping a record. She was saving screenshots. She was writing dates in the small notebook she always carried. She was organizing. She had been doing it since before I came home from the hospital, since somewhere around day 2, when it became clear that the pattern of this week was not an accident, but a reflection of something much older. My husband came home 10 days after my surgery. He arrived with a bottle of Chianti, a small leather purse he had picked out at a market in Florence, and the kind of energy a person brings home from vacation, sun-warmed, a little restless, full of stories. He hugged me carefully, which I appreciated. He asked how I was feeling, which I also appreciated. Then, within 20 minutes of setting down his bags, he was on the couch telling my grandmother about a cooking class he had taken in the Tuscan hills. I watched her face while he talked. She smiled at the right moments. She asked polite questions. She was so good at it that I almost missed the small notebook sitting quietly on the kitchen counter where she had left it. Almost. The weeks that followed were difficult in a way that was hard to name. Physically, I improved steadily. I went back to work part-time in late March. I started sleeping through the night again. The soreness faded, but something in our house had shifted, and we were both pretending it hadn't. My husband seemed to believe that time was doing the work, that the trip was simply a thing that had happened, and we would both move past it eventually. He never apologized. He never asked me what the hardest part had been. He never said he wished he had made a different choice. I stopped waiting for him to. My mother-in-law called once, a few weeks after they returned, to say she hoped I was recovering well. It was a 3-minute conversation. She spent most of it telling me about a restaurant they had discovered near their hotel. I said thank you for calling, and hung up the phone, and stood in my kitchen for a long moment, before I could make myself move. My grandmother had gone back to New Brunswick by then, but she called every other day. We talked about ordinary things mostly. Her garden, a book she was reading, whether I'd been outside enough. But sometimes, at the end of a call, she would say something measured and careful, something that told me she was still thinking about everything she had seen. She never asked me to do anything or told me what to decide. She just stayed close. What I didn't know, during all those quiet weeks, was that she had been doing something else entirely in her home office. She told me later that it started with the messages. She had saved every text my husband had sent during those 10 days, every photo my mother-in-law had shared publicly while I was recovering. But then she had gone further. She had gone back through years of family history, with the careful attention of a woman who had been watching for a long time, and finally decided to stop looking away. She found the birthday where my in-laws had rearranged a family dinner around my brother-in-law's hockey tournament, without mentioning it to me until the day before. She found the Christmas where they had driven 4 hours to see him play in a regional competition, but had never once come to see me give a work presentation I had invited them to twice. She found messages, some that my husband had forwarded to me without thinking, where his mother had described my recovery as the timing being unfortunate for everyone. She found a pattern that stretched back years, quiet and consistent, and she documented all of it with the same steadiness she had brought to sitting beside my hospital bed. She never told me what she was doing, she just waited. The occasion that brought it all into the open was my in-laws' 40th wedding anniversary party. They had been planning it for months. A catered event at a golf club outside Halifax, family and friends coming from across the country. My mother-in-law had called me personally to ask if I could help with some of the planning, which I had done, because that's what I always did. I had made phone calls and confirmed RSVPs and spent 3 weekends in a row helping fold programs and choose centerpieces. When my grandmother called and told me she would be attending, I was surprised. She had met my in-laws only a handful of times and they were not close. When I asked why she wanted to come, she said only, I wouldn't miss it. Her voice was calm in that particular way that made me pay attention. A week before the event, she drove down from New Brunswick again. This time she brought a file folder, which she set on my kitchen table and left there without comment. I didn't open it. The night of the anniversary party, the golf club was warm and full of people. My mother-in-law wore a deep blue dress and moved through the room with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades managing her own image. My father-in-law shook hands and laughed loudly and made everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. My brother-in-law was there with his wife, charming and comfortable, at home in the center of things the way he always had been. I sat with my grandmother at a table near the back. She had dressed carefully, a pale gray blazer, small pearl earrings, hair done properly. She looked like someone's elegant grandmother at a family party. She also had the file folder tucked in the bag beside her chair, and I noticed it when she set the bag down. Dinner was served and cleared. Speeches were made by friends and family, warm and funny, and full of the kind of loving exaggeration that belongs to these evenings. My father-in-law wiped his eyes. My mother-in-law pressed her hand to her chest. Everything looked exactly the way they had wanted it to look. Then my grandmother stood up. At first it was so ordinary that no one reacted. An older woman getting to her feet at a family party, probably to offer a toast. Someone handed her a microphone. My father-in-law smiled and gestured for the room to give her attention. She thanked everyone for being there. She said 40 years was a remarkable achievement and that she meant that sincerely. She said she had driven down from New Brunswick because she believed that some things deserved to be said in front of witnesses. The room was still smiling. I was not. She opened the folder. She began with February. She gave the date of my surgery. She described what the doctor had told me and what the risks had been. She said that I had asked my husband to stay, and he had gone anyway, and that while I was in the recovery room alone, this family had been boarding a flight to Italy. Then she started reading the messages. She read them slowly and clearly, the way a person reads something they want understood. She read my husband's 6-hour delayed text asking how the surgery had gone. She read my mother-in-law's Facebook captions posted during the days I spent unable to walk to the bathroom without help. She read the message about the pasta. She read the message about the hotel being beautiful. The room had gone completely quiet. My mother-in-law's face had changed in a way I had never seen before. My father-in-law had stopped smiling. My husband was staring at the table. My grandmother wasn't finished. She presented the rest of what she had compiled: the birthday, the Christmas, the email where my recovery had been described as unfortunate timing for everyone. Years of small, quiet indecisions that added up to a clear and consistent answer about whose comfort came first in this family and whose came last. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone of anything beyond what the record showed. She simply laid it out, piece by piece, in front of 60 people who had known this family for decades. When she closed the folder and sat down, the silence lasted long enough that I could hear the ventilation system running. My father-in-law recovered first. He took the microphone and said there had been a misunderstanding, that things had been taken out of context, that my grandmother was an elderly woman who didn't have the full picture. My mother-in-law said they loved me and that the trip had been a difficult decision made under difficult circumstances. The room didn't absorb it the way it usually would have. I could see people exchanging looks that were not sympathetic. An aunt on my father-in-law's side, a woman I had always liked, raised her hand and asked why no one had come home early when complications were a known risk. A cousin who had grown up with my husband said quietly that he had always noticed how differently the two brothers were treated by their parents. An old family friend said she was glad someone had finally said something, and she did not elaborate, but she didn't need to. One by one, things that had been left unsaid for years began entering the room. I sat beside my grandmother and I didn't speak. I had nothing to add. She had said it all more clearly than I ever could have, and the documents had said the rest. I wasn't dramatic or oversensitive or difficult to please. I was a woman who had asked for one thing and been told that thing wasn't worth rearranging a vacation for. And now everyone in that room could see it. My husband looked at me once, from across the table, and I looked back at him. There was no anger in me at that moment, which surprised me. Just a kind of clarity I had been waiting a long time to feel. The party ended early. The months that followed changed things in ways I am still sorting through. My husband and I had the honest conversations we should have had in February. Some of them were painful in a way I wasn't prepared for. Some of them were a relief. I am not going to tell you it was simple, because it wasn't, and I think people who tell you their hardest moments were simple are leaving something out. What I can tell you is that I stopped pretending things were fine when they weren't. And that alone changed everything. My in-laws tried, in their way, to repair things. My mother-in-law called and said she had never meant to make me feel unimportant. I believed she believed that, and I also understood that believing something and doing something are different kinds of knowing. My father-in-law sent a card. I appreciated the gesture and read it once and put it in a drawer. My grandmother never said she was sorry for what she had done. She didn't think she had done anything wrong, and neither did I. When I called her the week after the party, she answered on the second ring and asked if I wanted to talk about it. I said I thought I did. She said, "Good, I'll put the kettle on." We talked for 2 hours that evening, mostly about me, what I wanted, who I was becoming, what I had learned about the difference between family as a word and family as an action. She wasn't the kind of person who offered comfort as performance. She offered it as presence, which I had come to understand was the only kind that mattered. There is a particular evening I keep coming back to. It was a Sunday in late August, a few months after the party. I drove up to New Brunswick to spend a few days with her. We sat on the back porch in the evening, watching the light change over the yard she had tended for 40 years. She had a cup of tea cooling in her hands, and she was telling me about a rose bush she'd planted in the spring that had better than expected. We weren't talking about any of it. We were just sitting there together, in the ordinary way of two people who trust each other completely. At some point I looked over at her. This woman who had driven 4 hours in February without being asked, who had slept with the door open so she could hear me in the night, who had sat beside my bed with a crossword folded on her knee and waited for me to come back. And I felt something settle inside me that had been unsettled for a very long time. Family is not the name you share, or the house you grew up in. It is not the holidays where everyone shows up and plays their part. It is not the people who love you in theory or in photographs, or at anniversary parties in golf clubs. It is the person who drove 4 hours before anyone asked. It is the person who remembered what you took in your tea. It is the person who quietly wrote down every date, kept every record, and waited patiently for the moment when the truth could finally be heard by everyone who needed to hear it. When you are lying in a hospital bed, scared and alone, you find out exactly who your family is. I found out, that February, that mine was sitting beside me with a crossword on her knee, waiting for me to open my eyes.